Hi, I'm Caitlin, and this is Book Chats, and today I'm going to review Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This is not necessarily the type of book you expect to see me review on this channel, but it is the most recent book that I read for the book club that I'm part of. So I'm definitely in the minority when it comes to this book because I really did not enjoy it. And it seems like when I read other reviews and kind of read what people thought of it, that people got something out of it that I definitely didn't. But one of the things I love about my book club is that often when I go and attend and we discuss a book, it changes sort of how I perceive it and what I think of it. So I didn't want to say anything until I'd gone to book club. Book club was last week, so I went to book club and I can confidently say that going to book club did not change my mind about this book. It is a book that is ostensibly a little bit about kind of the love and grief between Lincoln and his son, but is also about just people who have died, what their lives are like, and the places they came from, the things that they kind of maybe regretted or like that haunted them in between, and like this kind of in between idea before you kind of go on to whatever is after life. So I don't know if that made any sense, but that's kind of an idea of what this novel was like. But what I really want to spend most of my time talking about is a very unusual format of this novel. So this is George Saunders' first novel. Previously, he's only written like poems and short stories. And I think in a lot of ways that kind of comes across in this book because it's definitely an unusual format and it kind of reads like a bunch of short stories kind of squished together. I was not about this format. I actually think that it would be really interesting to see this adapted as like a play or something that would be like a format, a more visual kind of medium that the format would make more sense in. But personally, like reading the book is really difficult to read, really hard time connecting, and I had the biggest problem. So there were two types of chapters that were interspersed in this novel. Some of the chapters were basically pieced together from historical narratives, a paragraph here, a couple sentences there, from like historical books about the Lincolns, kind of telling kind of the story of, you know, Abraham and his wife and how acted around Willie's death and how Willie's death affected them and how the Civil War was affecting them. Then the other chapters in the novel were these stories told by these souls in this kind of Bardo pre-afterlife graveyard kind of thing, and they were all like, they would say things and then there'd be like underneath it would say the name of the person saying it, so it was like all of these voices from all over, which felt so very much like it could be a play. It felt in some ways like the third act of Our Town, if you've seen it. The problem I had with this was twofold. One, it was really like disjointed and difficult to read, especially because, as many people at the book club noticed, so I read everything because I'm that person who reads everything, but many of the people at the book club with me during the sections that were like historical pieces, they didn't read any of the tags, like any of the citations. They just read it as if it was a straight narrative. But then when you get to the chapters that are the different people in the Bardo, those chapters you have to know who's saying what, so you have to read kind of the tags, and it's just a very weird experience. It's kind of like reading a play, but not really. It's really hard to explain. It was very choppy. It didn't really feel like there's a real narrative. There was eventually a plot to it, but it took a while to get to the plot, and the plot was kind of tenuous. It was really more of an excuse to hear from these different people who had died, hear about their lives, and that one thing in their life that so bothered them that they were clinging still to their life and pretending that they were not dead. But the really big problem I had with this book, and this is so me, and this is so why I have a different opinion than I'm sure a lot of people will about this book, but the problem I had is that the historical pieces are not all real, and they're not cited properly, and it just made me a little... So I'm reading it, and at first I'm like, oh wow, this seems to be like citations of something. So I like go to the back to look for bibliography. There's no bibliography. I'm like, huh. Well, I go to the front to the copyright page because I was like, I don't remember seeing in the copyright page like permission to excerpt all these things. And there are 3 books that in the front it's like we had permission to excerpt these in the copyright page. So I was like, this is really weird because there's definitely more than 3 books being cited here. First, what I did was I was like, these are all fake because they're not in the back, and there's only 3 of them that are like cited in the front, and so these are fake. They're fake historical sources, which nothing ticks me off more than fake historical sources, guys. But then, as I was going, suddenly I came to one that referenced Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and I know that that's a real book. And so I was like, wait a minute, that's a real book. So I Wikipedia'd it, and I found out it's a mixture of real and fake, but there's no distinction. There's nothing to tell you what's real and what's fake. There's no bibliography in the back. There's very little information on the copyright page, and it just makes me so mad. Because, I mean, here's one thing. fascinating narrative thing to do. And there's almost no one you could do this with except Lincoln, because so many books have been written about Lincoln. And it's a fascinating idea to say, I'm going to go back and look at these, many of them primary sources, and see what they say about Lincoln and this situation and Willie dying and its significance in the war and his life, and what these other like commentators have said about that. And I'm going to use it to piece together this kind of narrative that will be the frame for this fanciful story I've made that kind of imagines in the meantime. But it's not, like, some of it's that, but it's also cheapened by the fact that he just made some things up when he didn't have what he needed, but he pretends that it's real. And for me personally, I couldn't get over that. I couldn't get over the fact that if you're going to use this narrative method and it's real, it's fascinating and it's interesting and it's like, wow, you pieced this together, and yeah, it's a little choppy, but you were piecing it together from original material. But then you didn't. You also wrote your own material. So you choose to have this very choppy form to trick us into thinking this is real, and some of it is real, but some of it is not. And it was just something that really bothered me about the book, and the trickery bothered me, but also the fact that it's in this format that's really difficult to read, that bothered me a lot too. Now, one of the things that is especially interesting about this is that I'm actually on hold for the audiobook, and I might actually still listen to the audiobook because it was recently recommended to me, because they got like 160 plus people to narrate the audiobook, because that's how many characters are in this book. When you get into the graveyard, everybody has a story to tell and everyone wants to tell it, and there are so many characters. And I've heard even that I have to listen all the way to the end because there's some characters that say some things particular at the end that you really want to hear, and you want to hear it performed by the people who perform it. But I also cannot imagine listening to this audiobook without having the physical book in front of you, or like having already read the physical book, because it's so choppy and difficult to follow. And I think that a lot of people like really like that, and they're like, he's doing something daring and new. And if you're all about authors who do something daring and new that you've never seen before, maybe you should check it out. Although in a lot of ways it sort of reads like a play, but like a choppy, hard to follow play. But it just didn't work for me, and I don't put such an award on novelty that like difficulty in reading and difficulty in understanding the narrative is dismissed by me. So the characters were really interesting in a lot of ways, but it made the book feel really meandering and largely plotless to have so many of them. It was, if I can say anything really positive about this book, what was interesting about it is it definitely had something to say about how we as people can get so fixated on ourselves and on a single piece of ourselves that we forget other people, and we also forget other pieces of ourselves. And that was really interesting, and it was interesting to see it taken to the extremes that it was in this kind of like afterlife Bardo purgatory type place. But it made it so that each character was so self-focused that it was hard to really follow the plot. And it was, again, like a really difficult read. I would not have finished this book if I wasn't reading it for book club. I would have DNF'd it so fast because it just wasn't very interesting, it wasn't very easy to read, and I just didn't really care. Have been looking into reviews of people who read it and really enjoyed it to try to kind of understand, what did you see in this book that I didn't? And one of the things that comes up over and over is people saying, I love the portrayal of grief in this novel. I love the portrayal of grief in this novel. I love what it had to say about Lincoln's grief for his son and his son's grief for having died. And I did not get that out of this book at all. To me, this book didn't speak of grief the way that it seems to have spoken to other people. And I think grief, even, you know, I'm reading Option B by Adam Grant and Sheryl Sandberg right now, and that moved me more in the first 15 minutes of the audiobook, so like less than a chapter, than this entire novel moved me. And so I think maybe it just whatever I was supposed to get out of this book about grief or people or humanity, I didn't get it. It just all went over my head. I didn't get that out of it. And so that was frustrating to me, to have read this whole novel that I really struggled through and to just not have gotten whatever I was supposed to get out of it. The book obviously says, the title is Lincoln and the Bardo. It's a kind of ostensibly about Lincoln, Willie Lincoln, and his death and his father and how he dealt with that. But I actually feel like this wasn't necessarily a good book for someone who's a huge Lincoln fanatic or fan to read, because I think that although George Saunders pulled from like several real sources and definitely did his research, I think he also reached beyond that, and some of the conclusions he kind of is leading you to, I think you wouldn't necessarily go along with if you know more about Lincoln and the Civil War. It just felt like the Lincoln that I know from other like more historical in-depth sources was not really the Lincoln of this novel. This Lincoln felt a little more like kind of a pop culture Lincoln, or someone who, I mean, we all as Americans have heard of Lincoln and know a little bit about him, and this felt a little more like, you know a little bit about Lincoln, so we're going to lead you in this direction, and because we built this narrative around it, you're going to make conclusions, and I don't know how I felt about that. Lincoln and the Bardo for me was not an enjoyable book. I would have DNF'd it if I could, but I wanted to finish it to talk about it at my book club, and everyone else in my book club didn't necessarily really love it either. We all felt it was kind of written in a really difficult to follow way, and some of it seemed kind of gratuitous and unhelpful. But I will say that it is obviously a book that is getting a ton of press right now, and I think it's pretty easy to tell very early whether or not the style is going to work for you, and obviously the style is one of the things that really was the biggest hindrance to my enjoying this book. And so I would recommend downloading a sample or checking out from the library or just perusing it on a shelf and read I would say 3 chapters and see if you can kind of get into the style. And if the style is not as big of a problem to you, it might be worth checking out just to be able to be part of the dialogue around this novel. But if the style is something that you're struggling with, or if you just really find yourself struggling to care like I did, you're not going to care as you get on further into the book. Like, you're not going to care more. You're not really going to. I'm also going to mention that there are 2 or 3 things that are possibly trigger warnings for this book. There is some allusion to rape, although it is not described, and it's definitely not like there's no detail about it, but there's an allusion to a character who definitely suffered a lot at the hands of men in her life. And there is also some really overt racism in this book. Not something that is not, it's not something that we're trying to pass across as okay, but this book is obviously like set during the Civil War in a graveyard, so there's some people who've been there for a long time and closer, and there is some super overt racism from some like old school Revolutionary War souls that are dead, and there's also some racism just within the graveyard in where people are buried and what people say about the burial, different people buried in different parts of the cemetery. I don't think in any way that this is supposed to be excused or acceptable. I think it's very much like a commentary on what's happening and kind of trying to weave it in to the Civil War and to be realistic about how graveyards actually would have been at the time period. But if that's something that's going to be like super triggery to you, or that you just don't want to read, then skip it. And so, yeah, that's the Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. I hope that was a helpful review. You're welcome to ask me more about it in the comments, but I can't guarantee I will change my mind. If you read this book and really loved it, I'm actually still looking for someone who really loved it to really talk to me about what they loved about it, because I just feel like I just don't get it. It just did not, it just went, whew, like over my head. I guess I am just too, my tastes are just too plebeian, I guess, for this novel. But thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.